November of 2023, I made a video where I talked about the coasters that surprised and disappointed me in 2023, and it's time to do the same thing for the coasters that surprised and disappointed me in 2024. I would have liked to have had this video out sooner, but I was working on a video where I talked about the 10 years I've been a coaster enthusiast, and you can check that out via the link in the description. So that's why this video is coming out later than I would have liked. Unlike last year, which had 10 coasters for each list, this year has 15. Before I get into the top 15, I have some honorable mentions. First are two GCIs that I couldn't decide which way they'd fall, and the first is Mystic Timbers at Kings Island. You may be surprised that I almost considered Mystic Timbers to be a winner, especially since I've never been a fan of this GCI. The reason why I took it into consideration is because I found this coaster can be really good, but only when the track is wet. Even with a smaller amount of room between me and the lap bar, the airtime was way stronger when the track was wet. On the rides where the track was dry, however, it was just as lame as I remembered it, so I couldn't put it on either list. The other GCI is the one in my home park, American Thunder at Six Flags St. Louis. This coaster is usually inconsistent, but I thought it ran great in 2023. This year, however, it was all over the place. Some rides were extremely lackluster, while others were so good that it rivaled the rides it gave in 2019. I've always said that 2019 was the best year for American Thunder, so getting some rides in 2024 that were almost 2019 level was a very pleasant surprise. The last coaster that could go either way is Time Traveler at Silver Dollar City. I got 14 rides on it this year between my trips in March, August, and November, and my 5 rides in March were not very good, especially my first one since I faced forwards the whole time in the back car. My 5 rides in August were very good though, but my 4 rides in November were hit or miss. While my disappointing rides were really disappointing, the good rides I got were really good, and that's why I can't put Time Traveler on either list. A few extra honorable mentions for disappointments include Judge Roy Scream at Six Flags Over Texas, SheiKra at Busch Gardens Tampa, Iron Shark at Galveston Pleasure Pier, and Blue Hawk at Six Flags Over Georgia. For surprises, there's La Vibora and New Texas Giant at Six Flags Over Texas, Diamondback at Kings Island, and Thunderbird at Holiday World. Now let's start off the top 15 for each list. My number 15 disappointment is Roadrunner Express at Six Flags Fiesta Texas. I first rode this Aero Mine Train in 2019, and I couldn't enjoy the ride because Iron Rattler was closed on that trip. Since Roadrunner Express runs right next to IRAD, the only thing I could think about was how I'd been spotted out what is widely considered the best ride in Texas. I revisited Six Flags Fiesta Texas for Roller Coaster Rodeo this year, and since Iron Rattler was open this time, I was able to ride Roadrunner Express without being taunted by a massive RMC hybrid. Since I rode with a critical eye, I found that Roadrunner Express wasn't a particularly strong mine train. The setting on the quarry wall was cool, but the ride itself was boring and also surprisingly janky. I get that it's an aerodynamics mine train, so some jank is to be expected, but I find it weird how Adventure Express at Kings Island is much smoother despite being 6 years older. Roadrunner Express is only number 15 on this list because it wasn't as disappointing as the coaster was higher, but the boring layout and rougher rides what put it on the list in the first place. My number 15 surprise is Fire in the Hole at Silver Dollar City. This is the park's new for 2024 reimagining of the original Fire in the Hole that closed at the end of 2023, and I was really intrigued to see how it compared. I gotta say that I was a lot more impressed than I thought I would be. While the drops on the new version didn't have the same airtime that the original had, the updated theming and on-ride soundtrack make up for it. The on-ride soundtrack in particular adds so much to the ride experience, especially since it includes some dialogue with some of the characters talking. This fixed an issue I had with the original version of Fire in the Hole, that being the amount of silence throughout the ride. That being said, if I had only gotten one ride on it, it would have easily been on the disappointment list since the on-ride soundtrack wasn't working, and the amount of silence in that ride because of that was annoying. Thankfully, it worked on my other 9 rides thus far, and I really loved it. I considered putting Fire in the Hole higher on the list, but I don't feel right about doing that since it's more of a dark ride than a coaster. My number 14 disappointment is Kentucky Flyer at Kentucky Kingdom. This was my first experience with a Gravity Group family coaster, and I heard it had solid airtime despite being on the smaller side. I rode it twice with one ride in the front and the other in the back, and the airtime wasn't there. Granted, those rides did come in the morning about 45 minutes after the park opened, so it was likely running slow. Since I never rode it later in the day either, I definitely screwed up with this one. I can't justify ranking Kentucky Flyer higher than number 14 because of that, and also because I found it to be smooth, which is not something I'm used to with the Timberliner trains. The previous experiences I've had with Timberliners were on Switchback at ZDT's amusement park in 2019 and Mindblower at Fun Spot Kissimmee in 2021. Both of those were rougher than I expected. Kentucky Flyer's smoothness helps it rank lower on this list, and thank goodness it's smooth because if it was rougher, it definitely would rank higher. My number 14 surprise is Wildfire at Silver Dollar City. This B&M sit-down has always been a ride that I've enjoyed, but I never really thought much of. I thought my rides in 2017 and 2020 weren't that good, but my 2021 and 2023 rides were better. Then I rode it in 2024, and it gave the most intense rides I've had on it. That was especially true for my rides during Coaster Christmas in November. Granted, it was extremely foggy out there on my first few rides, so maybe it seemed more intense than it actually was because I could hardly see what was coming next. But my third ride wasn't in the fog, yet it was just as intense. Then I got my first ever front row night ride, which took the intensity to another level. Wildfire really impressed me in 2024, and it deserves a spot on this list. My number 13 disappointment is Batman the Ride at Six Flags Over Georgia. This has always been my favorite Batman clone ever since I first rode it in 2021. It took each of the elements faster than all the others, resulting in a much more intense ride experience. I felt the same way about it in 2023, but my 2 rides on it this year weren't that good. I'm not sure why it felt less intense this time, but I also noticed that it was running a lot rougher this year, especially in the back row. Maybe the ride running rougher and the less intense ride experience are related, but I was disappointed with Over Georgia's Batman clone this year. I also wonder if I found it to be less intense because I was spoiled by the intensity intensity found on 2 other B&Ms that I'd ridden earlier in the trip, those being the Incredible Hulk coaster at Islands of Adventure and Montu at Busch Gardens Tampa. That being said, it's still my favorite Batman clone, and this keeps it lower on the list. My number 13 surprise is Poltergeist at Six Flags Fiesta Texas. This premier ride spaghetti bowl coaster is widely considered to be the best one out there, between the better theming and the lack of a mid-course brake run, and the latter in particular made for an excellent ride experience. I first rode this in 2019 when the station was so much worse than it is now, and after riding it again in 2024, the theming was really nice. I was also impressed with how fast the ride's second half was. In between my 2 trips to Six Flags Fiesta Texas, I ridden both Flight of Fear clones, and despite having the same layout as Poltergeist, both of them had a harsh mid-course brake run that made the second half less intense. Poltergeist didn't have a mid-course, so that second half was ridiculous, especially at night. The last few turns before the corkscrew were the stars of the show here. I also found the 4 inversions to be really intense as well. I would even say it's the best ride at Fiesta Texas outside the 2 RMCs. While Poltergeist surprised me this year, there are several coasters that surprised me even more than it, and that's why it ranks as low as it does. My number 12 disappointment is Goliath at Six Flags Over Georgia. I hate to knock one of my top 5 parks twice in a row, but Goliath was another ride that disappointed me in 2024. I would have ridden this B&M Hyper in 2023, but it wasn't open the day I visited Six Flags Over Georgia. It's a shame that it wasn't, because it was a coaster in the park that I was most excited to get back on. My most recent ride on Goliath prior to this year was in 2021, and after I rode it, I heard a lot of people saying it's the best B&M Hyper because it had ejector airtime. My one ride in Goliath in 2021 was in the front row fairly early in the day, so I'm convinced that it was running slow. I made sure to try it later in the day this year, as well as try it in the back row, which I had never done before. I got 3 rides on Goliath, with 2 in the front and 1 in the back, including a night ride, and the airtime was not ejector. My first 2 rides were disappointing, but my night ride was a bit better, so I can kind of start to see where people are coming from when they say it's the best B&M Hyper. As of now, I haven't ranked 3rd in my B&M Hyper list, after Mako at SeaWorld Orlando and Diamondback at Kings Island. Goliath ranks this low because it started and ended this year as my number 3 B&M Hyper, so it didn't drop in my list. My number 12 surprise is Aquaman Power Wave at Six Flags Over Texas. This mock ride's Power Splash was a coaster that I had greatly underestimated. I wasn't too excited for it because it gets you soaked, and I'm not huge on getting soaked on rides. However, the forces this ride had were very solid. The launches were good, and the airtime on the airtime hill was unexpected. I especially loved the backwards airtime on the last launch. While the splashdown did absolutely soak me, it honestly felt incredible because of how hot it was at Six Flags Over Texas. I even considered going for a re-ride, but it was down a good amount of the time I visited, and the line was long when it was open, so I could only get 1 ride on it. The forces on Aquaman helped it enter my top 5 in the park, and I was not expecting that. Aquaman Power Wave is the first of multiple coasters at Six Flags Over Texas you'll see on the surprise list, and I think it's underrated. My number 11 disappointment is Cobra's Curse at Busch Gardens Tampa. This mock ride spinning coaster is similar to Wildfire in that I've enjoyed each of my rides, but I didn't think much of it. My first ride in 2021 had some good spinning to it, but the spinning on the other rides wasn't as good. My 2024 rides on Cobra's Curse have what I call the Pandemonium Curse. If you're unfamiliar, I rarely get spinning whenever I ride the Pandemonium clones, even when the car is off balance. Cobra's Curse had that same issue on each of my 3 rides this year. Each of my rides consisted of no more than 3/4 of a rotation the whole time, and it was really frustrating. Given how the rest of the ride didn't have any notable forces either, it was extremely boring, and I had to drop it in my list for that reason. My number 11 surprise is Titan at Six Flags Over Texas. The current tallest and fastest coaster in Texas is also one of the state's best in my opinion. Most people don't care about this coaster because it doesn't have as much airtime compared to other hypercoasters, but as someone who loves speed and intensity more than airtime, Titan was my type of ride. The sense of speed on this ride was so good, and the upward T-Lux was so much more intense than I remembered. I graded out so hard on both my rides this year, and I was amazed by the sheer power it had. I even got some good airtime on the floater hill before said Helix. Titan is my number 2 coaster in the state of Texas, and I honestly wasn't surprised about that given how Titan has my coaster preferences. That's why Titan ranks outside the top 10 on the surprises list, and this is the coaster that I wish Raging Bull at Six Flags Great America was. My number 10 disappointment is Raven at Holiday World. It feels so weird to call a coaster at my favorite park a disappointment, but my rides on Raven this year weren't that great. My 2023 rides were really good though, and I was hopeful that it would run the same in 2024. As you can tell by its appearance on the disappointment list for this year, that wasn't the case. I should mention that I didn't try the back row this year, but I was hesitant on trying after my last back row ride in 2022, which was quite rough. I also heard that the fish drop was firing this year, which makes me regret not trying the back row even more. Next time I go, I'll make it a point to try the back of the train on Raven, but in the second back row instead of the very back row. Raven was in my top 50 after last year, but there's no way I can give it a top 50 spot this year after my 2 lackluster rides in July. My number 10 surprise is Steel Eel at SeaWorld San Antonio. This Morgan Mini Hyper gets completely overshadowed by several other coasters in the state, most notably the 2 RMCs just down the road at Six Flags Fiesta Texas, but I was super impressed with Steel Eel this year. I did get 2 rides on this in 2019, and I remember the first half having great airtime while the second half was kinda lackluster. I got 3 more rides this year, and the airtime in the first half was even better than it was in 2019. Then the second half actually had surprisingly good airtime. I originally had Steel Eel ranked below Steel Force at Dorney Park, but that has since changed after my rides this year. I know this is controversial, but Steel Eel ended up being my second favorite in San Antonio, and cracks the top 10 for coasters that surprised me this year. My number 9 disappointment is Kraken at SeaWorld Orlando. I first rode this B&M floorless coaster in 2021, and it was similar to my initial thoughts on Wildfire. In other words, a solid yet pretty forceless B&M looper. However, Kraken got repainted the year after I visited, and I heard the repaint made the ride way more intense. I was super intrigued to see how much better it was, but little did I know that the mid-course was reprogrammed at the start of the year to slow the trains down a considerable amount. This was really disappointing to me, as the second half actually felt less intense than my rides in 2021. In 2021, the mid-course was off, so the second vertical loop and corkscrew were decently intense. And ultimately, I prefer my 2021 rides on Kraken over my 2024 rides. One thing I was not expecting this year was for Kraken to be a smooth ride. I heard the rattle on it was insane, and I was nervous that this could ruin the ride. To my surprise, it was one of the smoothest floorless coasters I've ridden. It might even be the smoothest one I've done, although Medusa at Six Flags Great Adventure might have it beat. The smoothness is what puts Kraken at number 9 and not higher. We'll talk about another B&M floorless coaster where the smoothness was a much bigger issue later on. My number 9 surprise is Texas Stingray at SeaWorld San Antonio. I just said that Steel Eel was my second favorite coaster in San Antonio, and it turns out my favorite coaster in San Antonio resides in the same park. This awesome GCI wooden coaster was a ride that I initially wasn't too hyped for, but after watching a POV of it, it looked like it could potentially take the spot of my top GCI. I found out that this would also be my 300th coaster not long before my Texas trip, and my expectations for Stingray went up because of that. It's safe to say I was not disappointed. Well, I actually was a little underwhelmed at first because the op stapled me on my first ride, so I didn't get any airtime on it. I got 4 more rides throughout the day, and each of them was packed full of airtime since the op didn't staple me. The pacing was also relentless, and overall I'm very glad this is my 300th coaster because there were 2 coasters on the disappointment list that I initially would have preferred to make my 300th. As for where Texas Stingray ranks in my GCI list, it couldn't quite take the top spot, as that still goes to Prowler Worlds of Fun, but Texas Stingray was able to beat out Thunderhead at Dollywood for my number 2 spot. This coaster deserves more recognition when talking about elite wooden coasters, and easily lands on the surprise list. My number 8 disappointment is Shockwave at Six Flags Over Texas. This Schwarzkopf looper was a coaster that I really needed to re-ride, having only done it once in 2019 prior to this year. I thought the loops were not the most intense, and the airtime was kinda but that's because I wasn't in the back row. I didn't call it overrated back then because I knew I needed to try what's widely considered the best row on the coaster. I was really excited to give Shockwave another try this year, and I made sure to try the front and back. While the airtime was good in the back, it wasn't the ultra elite ejector that people made it out to be. I found the back-to-back loops to be the same as before, so not very intense. I surprisingly prefer the front row over the back on Shockwave because the sense of speed up there was pretty decent, and the loops hit harder in the front from my experience. I do think Shockwave is a little overrated now that I've tried the back, and it doesn't quite make it into my top 5 at Six Flags Over Texas. But because the forces were solid, it's in the middle of the list. My number 8 surprise is Thunder Run in Kentucky Kingdom. I first rode this Dane Corporation wood coaster in 2017, and I didn't remember anything about it. I hadn't heard many enthusiasts talking about it between 2017 and 2024, so my expectations for it this year were pretty low. To my surprise, the airtime on this thing is legit, especially up front in the first half. The second half even had some airtime too. In the back it was decent, but it was also significantly rougher back there. I also found the laterals up front to be very strong, and overall I was super impressed. Thunder Run has the misfortune of being at Kentucky Kingdom, meaning you have critically acclaimed airtime machines, Storm Chaser, and Lightning Run in the same park. While it gets overshadowed because of that, I would go as far as to put it at number 2 in the park. Much like Texas Stingray, I think Thunder Run should get more attention because it's got a lot of great forces to it, but there are a few coasters that surprised me even more this year, and that's why it ranks in the middle of the list. My number 7 disappointment is Banshee at Kings Island. I've noticed that this B&M member seems to be temperamental when it comes to how it runs. In 2020 it was brutally rough, although that's because I was stuck in the middle of the train. 2021 and 2022 was excellent, but 2023 was a hit or miss. The intensity was great, but I noticed that the vests were extremely tight. They felt almost as bad as the vests on X-Flight at Six Flags Great America for me. And in 2024, Banshee was just not great. Not only did it feel as intense as in recent years, but the vests were even worse than they were in 2023. Brian and I got stuck on Banshee's final brake run for around 15 minutes, and the vests were unforgiving. It felt so much worse than the vests on X-Flight, and it was overall unpleasant. As if the vests being worse wasn't already a problem, the rattle on Banshee was absolutely brutal this year as well. My last ride in particular was in the front row of the blue train, and the train felt like it was bouncing up and down the whole ride. I had a bad headache after it, and it was the worst I've seen it run since 2020. Because of how bad Banshee ran this year, I had to put it on the list of disappointments for this year, and it went from a top 3 B&M invert down to a mid-tier B&M invert. My number 7 surprise is Mako at SeaWorld Orlando. This is the best B&M hyper in the country, and it's not even close. I got 20 rides on Mako during my first trip in 2021, and I couldn't get enough of the amazing soundtrack the coaster had, as well as the world-class floater airtime. Soon after I rode Mako, I started hearing a good amount of people saying it's not that great for B&M hyper, and it makes me wonder if I caught it at a really good time. I got to try it again in 2024, and it was even better than in 2021. I got another 50 rides on Mako, and the airtime blew my mind. I rode it during all times of day, front and back, and I was way out of my seat each time. The 5-second floater hill might be my favorite airtime moment now because I was out of my seat for the whole element. The speed hill also hit with great flojector airtime. I even got a few rides with the trim brake on the Camelback after the hammerhead was turned off, so the airtime on that hill was much better than in 2021. The first drop was also a lot better than I remembered as well. I even found the second half to be a lot of fun since I ragdolled on it frequently, and the laterals were surprisingly decent. Mako broke into my top 20 with how good my 50 rides were this year, and it deserves to be in the upper half of my surprises list. My number 6 disappointment is Boardwalk Bullet at Kimo Boardwalk. I was so hyped for this Gravity group wooden coaster, and I was expecting this to be in my top 25 and maybe even my top 10. As someone who has Voyage as their number one coaster, the fact that some people were saying Boardwalk Bullet is almost as good meant this thing could rank really high. I got 5 rides on it, and the first half was phenomenal between the strong airtime and great laterals. While the ride started off great, it did have pacing issues towards the end of the ride, and this was a major buzzkill for me. Granted, despite riding it later in the day, each of my rides were in practically empty trains, so it's possible it was running slow. Until I get back on it, this coaster is barely in my top 5 coasters in Texas. Despite expecting a top 25 coaster out of it at the least, Boardwalk Bullet barely made my top 50. Because it made the top 50 though, that's what keeps it out of my top 5 disappointments for the year. My number 6 surprise is Montu at Busch Gardens Tampa. This B&M invert is the best one I've ridden, and the reasons why it's on the surprises list is similar to Mako with one major difference. I've never had any disappointing rides on Mako, but Montu left me disappointed in 2022. I first rode it in 2021 and it was really good. The whip on all the inversions was great, and the positives on the valleys were great out-inducing. In 2022, however, the ride felt far less intense, although that's because I never got to ride in the left outside seat. No matter what row you sit in, the left outside is by far the best seat, and I was stuck with the right outside seat both times I rode in 2022. Then in 2024, I got to ride the left outside seat multiple times, and it was incredible. The Zero G roll in particular was so good in that seat, and the corkscrew was a lot better than I remembered it. I even got a ride where the trim brake before the Batwing was turned off, and this made that element far more intense since the train took it with more speed. Montu knocked my socks off this year, but it couldn't quite crack the top 5 surprises for the year. My number 5 disappointment is Superman Krypton Coaster at Six Flags Fiesta Texas. Remember how I said I'd be later addressing a B&M floorless coaster where the rattle was a much larger issue when I was talking about Kraken? Well, this is the one. I didn't think highly of this B&M floorless coaster when I first rode in 2019, as it didn't have any notable forces. I did notice a slight rattle on it, but it wasn't enough to completely ruin the ride. My one ride in 2019 was in the front row, and I heard it smoother in the back. I made sure to try the back row on Superman this year, and I found the rattle back there would be worse than my ride in 2019. Despite being pretty rough, little did I know that this back row ride, along with my front row ride right beforehand, would be glossy smooth when compared to my rides later that night. I previously said that I went to Six Flags Fiesta Texas for Roller Coaster Rodeo, and since the park was open late for the event, I was able to get a night ride on several coasters this year. I tried to see how many coasters I can get a Zen ride on during the full park extra ride time, and Superman was not one of them because the rattle on it at night was brutal. I'd even say it was the second roughest B&M I've ridden because of that. I had a massive headache after it, and despite the mid-course being turned off, offering better forces in the second half, the rattle was even worse than the second half, and that's the sole reason it lands in the top 5 disappointments of the year for me. My number 5 surprise is Storm Chaser at Kentucky Kingdom. Finally, we have a true redemption story. My first ride in 2017 was not good because my mom made the ride off staple meat, and this meant I got no airtime on it. I made sure to not get stapled this year, and I was absolutely blown away by the sheer power of this ride. Storm Chaser's airtime is downright ridiculous, and I surprisingly thought the front row was better. The closest thing I compare Storm Chaser to is Twisted Timbers at King's Dominion, and that coaster was way better in the back row. I was fully expecting Storm Chaser to be a back row ride like its Virginia counterpart, but the back row felt like a kiddie ride compared to the front row. I don't know if it always runs like this, but the airtime I got up front on several elements felt stronger than the airtime of Air Force One and Fun Spot Atlanta. The trick track double up was ridiculous, the Camelback after the first drop was insane, and the Helix at the end had surprising laterals. My brother did a ride forces at the end of the night, and it somehow recorded negative 2.9 Gs in the trick track double up, which doesn't even make sense. Despite several RMCs opening after Storm Chaser, I think it's one of the better ones, and it deserves to be in the top 5 surprises for the year. My number 4 disappointment is Lightning Run at Kentucky Kingdom. Much like the other coasters at this park, I first rode this coaster in 2017, and the restraint stapled me so the ride was very uncomfortable. I couldn't enjoy it very much because of that, but I figured I'd be able to avoid getting stapled this year. I got 2 more rides on it, front and second to back, and I had the exact same issue that I had in 2017. The restraint wasn't an issue at the start of the ride, but by the second half it was really uncomfortable. I thought Lightning Run had an outside shot at entering my top 25, but it didn't even crack my top 100. Because it's not in my top 2 at the park and how it ranks much lower than I expected, that's why it's so high on the disappointment list. My number 4 surprise is Batman the Ride at Six Flags Over Texas. I had this as my lowest ranked B&M invert after my first ride in 2019. It was the least intense invert by far, and I also found it to have a lot of headbanging, which wasn't an issue on the others. I was expecting it to ride the same when I went to give it another try at the start of June, but it was the exact opposite. Batman was running very intense, and it was very smooth this time. I was astonished by how well it was running on my first ride up front that I tried it again in the back, and while it wasn't as smooth back there, it was still much better than in 2019. After my 2 rides on it this year, I found out that Batman had recently undergone refurbishment, and now would explain why I was running so much better this year. It went from my lowest ranked invert to one of the better ones, and I'd also say it's my number 4 Batman clone, with the only ones ahead of it are Six Flags Over Georgia's, Six Flags St. Louis's, and Six Flags Great America's. I even preferred it over Shockwave, which I wasn't expecting. I didn't think Batman the Ride would rise over 100 spots on my list prior to my rides this year, but it did, and that's why it ranks so high on this prize list. My number 3 disappointment is Iron Rattler at Six Flags Fiesta Texas. I had heard so much about this RMC hybrid over the years, and I was so excited to ride it in 2019. Unfortunately, this is the one ride at Fiesta Texas that was closed for me during that trip, and it was a major buzzkill since everyone said it was the best ride in Texas. Between 2019 and 2024, I continued to hear more about how great the first drop and the drop off the quarry wall are, and people were hyping up to be a top tier RMC. Given the massive amount of hype, my expectations for Iron Rattler were the highest I've had for any RMC. As you can tell by its appearance on the top 3 of the disappointment list, it didn't even come close to living up to the hype. Instead of a top tier RMC, Iron Rattler was a bottom tier RMC because the ride was short and there were way too many dead elements. Each of the overbank turns on the quarry wall did nothing for me, and the pacing was weaker than what people made it out to be. On top of all the dead elements on the quarry wall, the first drop wasn't even top 3 RMC drops for me, and the drop off the quarry was decent floater at best. Even though I rode it during all times a day since I went during Roller Coaster Rodeo, I came off Iron Rattler wanting a lot more. At least the one inversion was solid, and the same can be said for the airtime hill right after it, but my favorite part ended up being the turn into the brake run. The laterals on that element were way stronger than I expected, but those 3 elements can't make up for how disappointed I was with the rest of the layout. I'm gonna be completely honest, I much prefer Wonder Woman Golden Lasso Coaster on the other side of the park. That coaster had much better pacing than Iron Rattler did, and I would even say New Texas Giant is a better RMC hybrid in Texas. That coaster was much longer and had much more powerful airtime as well. I thought about putting Iron Rattler at number 1 on the disappointment list, but I decided to put it at number 3 since at least it's a good ride, unlike the top 2 which are not good rides. My number 3 surprise is Revenge of the Mummy at Universal Studios Florida. Here's another coaster that I was spited out of in the past, but I got to ride for the first time this year. After my first ride on it, I was actually quite disappointed since the coaster section was shorter and less intense than I was expecting, and I much preferred Hollywood Rip Ride Rocket. I got 9 more rides on Mummy, and it kept getting better. The incline launch is a lot of fun. The airtime after that launch wasn't the best, but on a few of my rides it was pretty decent, and the theming of this coaster is fantastic. I especially love the fire effects on this coaster, although it's worth noting that not all of them were working. At least the fire on the ceiling of the fake ending was working, and that was a really cool sight. I also love the onboard audio for this coaster since it's some of the soundtrack used in The Mummy Returns. Having seen that movie before riding Revenge of the Mummy this year, it was so cool hearing some of that soundtrack on a roller coaster. What really pushed Revenge of the Mummy into my top 3 surprises is a production tour for this coaster. During this tour, I got to see some of the props used in the Mummy movies in the queue line, as well as a couple neat aspects of the queue line. Finally, I got to go under the ride and see some extremely rare views of the coaster. Huge shout out to my tour guide Dino for giving me this great experience, and also allowing me to get some rare off-ride shots of the coaster. I even got my own Medjai necklace as a keepsake, and this was the cherry on top. The production tour made me realize just how brilliant Revenge of the Mummy really is, and it deserves a top 3 spot on the surprise list. My number 2 disappointment is Pipeline the Surf Coaster at SeaWorld Orlando. When this B&M Surf Coaster was announced, I was really disappointed to see another stand-up coaster being built. I've never really liked stand-up coasters very much because of how uncomfortable they can be, but when Pipeline opened, I heard everyone rave about this thing. Not only did it have insane standing airtime, but it also fixed the problems with the old school stand-up coasters. I got 1 ride on it this year, but it was far from a great ride like people said it was. In fact, I would say the issues that the other stand-up coasters had were even more of an issue on Pipeline, especially when it came to the nut smashing. The airtime was also not there on most of the elements, but on the few that did have a tiny bit of airtime, the vest restraints were digging into my shoulders, which was very uncomfortable. There was not a single thing I liked about Pipeline, and I don't know how some people say it's the best ride at SeaWorld Orlando. This is by far the worst new credit I got this year, and it ranks in my bottom 5 overall. This could have very easily been number 1, but the reason why it ranks in number 2 is because I have heard some people say they had the same problems with Pipeline that I did. My number 2 surprise is Mr. Freeze at Six Flags Over Texas. I got to ride it forwards for the first time this year, and I initially wasn't expecting this to rank anywhere on my top 15 surprises, let alone in number 2. I honestly thought I might like both directions the same, if not backwards slightly more, but I was pleasantly surprised to find that I much preferred Mr. Freeze facing forwards. The forward launch in particular is amazing. It's incredibly sustained, and the sense of speed is outstanding, making for one of my favorite launches. I also found the spike to be much better forwards. In the front row, which is the only row I rode the forwards train on Mr. Freeze, the unobstructed view as you climb up the spike is super cool as you get close to the edge of the track, and then you get a backwards vertical drop from really hypercoaster heights. A lot of people prefer the spike backwards since you face down at the ground, and most people in general prefer Mr. Freeze backwards. While I can understand the argument for that, keep in mind that I've done it backwards a couple hundred times now, so it's not special to me anymore. I initially had Mr. Freeze ranked at number 1 since I wasn't expecting the experience provided by the forward train to be a top 10 coaster for me like it was, but the coaster I do have at number 1 gave some rides that were out of this world, and I couldn't overlook that. My number 1 disappointment is Kumba at Busch Gardens Tampa. It's no secret that I've never liked this B&M sit-down coaster, as I've always found it extremely forceless and unbearably rough. In 2021, I got a bruised ear from the headbanging I got, and in 2022, the headbanging was even worse, resulting in the worst headache I'd ever gotten from a coaster. It was after my trip in 2022 that I found out Train 3 was the rough train on Kumba, and that would explain why I thought it was so bad. Thankfully, they weren't running Train 3 when I went back to Busch Gardens Tampa this year, so I thought I'd finally be able to enjoy Kumba. I was on Train 2, and it sadly was just as rough this year as it was in 2022. The headbanging was severe and unavoidable since the train shook violently from side to side the whole ride, and there's not a single good element. My ride this year showed me that it's not the train that's rough, but rather the whole ride. I hear lots of people saying it's running glass smooth still, but that's not true at all. Because of how bad it was this year, it's still the number 2 worst coaster I've ever ridden, and it's the only coaster I felt right about putting at number 1 on the disappointment list. My number 1 surprise is Outlaw Run at Silver Dollar City. I really should have put this coaster at number 1 on the surprise list for last year's list because it broke into my top 10, but but it wasn't even an honorable mention on that video. I think it's safe to say that I righted the wrong from last year by putting it number 1 on this year's surprise list. The reason why Outlaw Run is number 1 on the surprise list for this year, despite still being in my top 10, is the fact that it managed to dethrone Lightning Rod at Dollywood for my favorite RMC. I got 5 rides on Lightning Rod in June of 2023, and I didn't think any RMC could top it for me. But in July of 2023, I got 20 rides on Outlaw Run, and it managed to pass up Iron Gwazi, Busch Gardens, Tampa for my number 2 RMC. I got several more rides on Outlaw Run this year with 8 in March and 7 in August, and those rides were so good that it started giving Lightning Rod a run for its money. And then I rode it during Coaster Christmas of this year, and there was so much fog surrounding Outlaw Run's layout, making it hard to see where I was going. My first few rides that day felt just as fast as it did in July of 2023 since the track was wet, and by the time it got dark out, Outlaw Run kicked into overdrive. It was still foggy out by nightfall, and the speed in which Outlaw Run was navigating the elements was so ridiculous. I heard from the ride-ups that it was going 72 miles an hour when it was supposed to go 68, and therefore it was less than a second away from overspeeding on every cycle. I've been so impressed with this thing over the past few years, and I feel bad about not putting it on the surprise list for last year. Because of how great my 45 rides over the last 2 years were, but especially my 10 rides in November of this year, Outlaw Run deserves the number 1 on the surprise list. Those were the 15 biggest surprises and disappointments of 2024 for me. What were your biggest surprises and disappointments of this year? I'm curious to know if you thought the same about any of the coasters I discussed in this video, or if your experience on any of these coasters were different from mine. Post any thoughts you have about either of those topics in the comments section. Of course, before you click off this video, please be sure to leave a like if you haven't done so already. Be sure to comment what you enjoyed about this video, and be sure to share it with someone else you may know. If you're new to this channel like we saw, please consider subscribing for more content like this. I'd appreciate you subscribing and turn the bell so you get notified every time I upload a new video. I also have an Instagram account for the pictures I take whenever I visit parks, so be sure to check me out there as well via the link in the description. Thank you guys again for watching, and I'll see you later.